January 1943. A wet moon hangs low over the occupied outskirts of Krakow, its pale light barely cutting through the drifting smoke that clings to the frozen streets. Inside an abandoned workshop behind a shattered tannery, a lone resistance fighter crouches beside a window frame stripped of its glass. His gloves tremble slightly, part cold, part anticipation, as he tightens the final cord on a crude, iron-reinforced crossbow resting across his knees. It doesn't look like a weapon worthy of fear. The frame is rough, the limbs uneven. A cylinder of homemade incendiary gel clings to the shaft of a thick metal bolt wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. The partisans had laughed when he showed it to them. They called it a fire arrow, a medieval joke against a modern army. Down the street, boots click against the cobblestones. 7 German officers approach the commandeered villa used as a field command post. Their voices drift upward, calm, confident, certain of control. He raises the crossbow slowly, braith held, bolt aligned. A single spark catches the soaked cloth, and the weapon everyone mocked transforms into a streak of burning light. And this moment, charged with desperation and defiance, opens the door to a far larger story. To understand the strange weapon that cut through the cold air of Krakow that January night, one must step back into the harsh machinery of German occupation in 1942-1943. Poland had endured 3 years under the general government, a brutal administrative structure designed to extract resources, suppress identity, and extinguish resistance. Curfews tightened, food rations collapsed, arrests and deportations surged. Every street seemed to echo with the same message: obedience or silence. Yet beneath that pressure, resistance networks multiplied. The Armia Krajowa, or Home Army, grew into one of Europe's largest underground movements. But its strength was undermined by one unchanging reality: firepower. Modern weapons were scarce, ammunition even scarcer. Smuggling routes were watched, raids were constant, and each small cell of fighters was forced to improvise or operate with whatever scraps they could scavenge. This environment bred a kind of desperate creativity. Partisans repurposed farm tools into blades, home-made explosives into traps, and mechanical scrap into crude firearms. Small workshops, hidden under barns, disguised as repair shops or tucked beneath ruined industrial blocks, became laboratories for quiet defiance. What emerged from them was not always elegant or reliable, but every device answered the same question: how can the powerless strike at the powerful? The man behind the so-called fire arrow crossbow was one such improviser. A former machinist before the war, he had spent years repairing agricultural equipment and metal presses. Now, under occupation, he used those same skills to turn broken gears, old stove springs, and bicycle parts into weapons. His workshop, though barely more than a dim room with a cracked concrete floor, became a refuge for engineering ideas that the better armed allies might dismiss, but the Home Army desperately needed. German officers saw the region as secure and predictable. Their outposts rotated in cycles. Their patrols marched by the same routes. Their confidence grew with each uneventful week, and their command staff, operating from villas on the outskirts, often believed themselves untouchable, a belief the resistance sought to challenge whenever opportunity allowed. By late 1942, intelligence reports indicated that a small group of German officers regularly gathered in one commandeered villa to coordinate railway inspections and oversee deportation transports. Direct assaults were nearly impossible. Gunfire would bring overwhelming reinforcements. Mines required proximity. Grenades risked detection. Poisoning attempts had failed. The resistance needed a silent strike, something unusual enough to penetrate their routine without alerting nearby units. It was during these discussions that the machinist presented his unusual idea: a silent mechanical launcher firing incendiary bolts. The concept was primitive in theory but practical in his mind. Germany's greatest vulnerability at these villas was the concentration of officers near wooden structures, fuel stores, and paper-filled rooms. If even one bolt ignited inside or near the group, the resulting fire could create chaos long enough for escape. Most dismissed it immediately. A crossbow was a relic. Fire arrows belonged in history books, not modern war. Some laughed openly. Others warned that the weapon would endanger its user more than the enemy. But the machinist persisted. He argued that silence mattered more than range. That fire could do what bullets could not. That in a city where every shot was heard and every echo investigated, the old could strike where the modern failed. And so, in secrecy and solitude, he built it, layer by layer, spring by spring, until the night came when doubt met action. The moment he released that burning bolt invites us to examine the story from several distinct angles. He had never imagined that years spent repairing threshers and wheel axles would become the foundation of armed resistance. Yet the machinist's life had followed a quiet rhythm long before the war: precision, patience, and a stubborn insistence on making broken things function again. When occupation arrived, that instinct transformed into something else: survival through invention. But within his own resistance cell, he remained an outsider. He wasn't a soldier, not in spirit or tradition. Others carried pistols smuggled from dead patrols or rifles hidden since the September campaign. He arrived with sketches on brown paper and hands calloused from metal filings. They laughed not out of cruelty, but disbelief, because the war they were fighting felt too modern, too severe, for a contraption that looked carved from another century. Yet beneath the skepticism lay a flicker of recognition. This was a man who had lost nearly everything, and in the absence of a rifle, he had carved a weapon out of resolve. That human stubbornness, that refusal to accept helplessness, gave the fire arrow its true origin. It wasn't born from fantasy, it was born from desperation carved into steel. What made his idea more than a curiosity was the tactical landscape of occupied cities. Silence was worth more than firepower. A single gunshot could bring 20 soldiers within minutes. Even a muffled pistol was risky. Sabotage operations relied on invisibility: kill quickly, leave no trace, melt into the dark. Resistance reports repeatedly highlighted the same problem. German officers moved confidently in small groups, often escorted only by routine. They relied on predictable paths, illuminated by lanterns or sparse street lamps. These narrow windows offered opportunities, but only to a weapon that left no report, no flash, no echo. A crossbow, crude yet quiet, fit that doctrine perfectly. And when it paired with incendiary material capable of spreading fire across uniforms and paper maps alike, it created a tactical advantage far greater than its medieval appearance suggested. The machinist wasn't reinventing warfare, he was adapting to its sharpest constraint: stealth. The device itself embodied the improvisational engineering that defined countless underground workshops across occupied Europe. The frame came from a broken printing press, its wood reinforced with iron slats hammered flat from fuel container lids. The bow arms were salvaged from a bent bicycle rim, reshaped with heat and pressure. Springs came from mattress coils, the trigger from a dismantled sewing machine. But the heart of the weapon was the incendiary mixture. Resistance chemists had long experimented with homemade fire compounds: gelled gasoline, potassium chlorate, tar, and oil dyes. The machinist refined these formulas until he had a thick, sticky incendiary that clung to surfaces and burned at high temperature. The bolt shaft, wrapped tightly in cloth and dipped into this mixture, became a crude equivalent of a modern incendiary projectile. When launched, the friction and small ignition spark created immediate combustion. Test shots revealed a flaw: if the cloth ignited too early, the bolt lost velocity. He solved it by adding a metal nose cone, allowing air pressure to delay the burn by fractions of a second. The result was a weapon that looked absurd but functioned with dangerous elegance. When the leadership of his cell evaluated his creation, their skepticism wasn't rooted only in practicality, it was rooted in doctrine. Polish resistance groups admired ingenuity, but also feared recklessness. A weapon that could burn an entire structure had implications beyond the target. If used improperly, it risked exposing civilians or torching safe houses. Moreover, commanders favored strategies already proven: rail sabotage, courier interception, targeted assassinations using pistols or grenades. The crossbow defied this logic. It didn't align with expectations, nor did it fit the image of disciplined rebellion. Yet it offered one undeniable advantage: plausible deniability. A silent incendiary strike could be framed as an accident, a lantern fire, or a heating mishap. For officers who believed themselves safe behind rank and routine, such misdirection mattered. Leadership eventually authorized a single field test, reluctantly, under strict conditions, and only because every conventional plan to strike the villa had failed. Their approval came not from trust in the machinist, but from despair in every other method. From the German perspective, the threat of unconventional weapons was both underestimated and feared. Their intelligence reports often highlighted partisan mines, stolen grenades, or ambushes using small arms. But a silent incendiary projectile, that seemed improbable. Yet they were aware of unusual sabotage attempts: Molotov cocktails tossed into windows, improvised flamethrowers in forests, arson attacks on supply depots. Officers stationed in Poland knew that resistance fighters were resourceful, though they rarely attributed real danger to crude devices. Many officers carried an air of superiority, well-trained, well-equipped, convinced that their doctrine could predict partisan behavior. That certainty created a blind spot. They walked in groups, assuming that any danger would announce itself with sound. They believed that fire belonged in fuel stores or workshops, not streaking through the air toward their formation. Their lack of anticipation did not arise from arrogance alone. It arose from fighting an enemy they assumed lacked both the tools and imagination for such a strike. But imagination, they would soon learn, required no permission. These intertwined perspectives, human, tactical, technological, doctrinal, and enemy, created the emotional and operational backdrop for what happened next. Each one pushed the machinist toward the moment when doubt shattered under the weight of action. And a single bolt of burning cloth rewrote the assumptions of those who mocked him. And that rising tension leads directly into the event that transformed improvisation into impact. The night of the operation arrived without ceremony, no stirring speeches, no last-minute instructions, just a cold wind slipping between shuttered buildings and the distant rumble of a transport truck grinding along frozen rails. The machinist walked alone to the abandoned tannery on the outskirts of Krakow, the crossbow concealed under a canvas sack. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from fear but from the knowledge that this was his only chance to prove his weapon was more than a curiosity. His cell had arranged the timing carefully. Resistance scouts had observed the German officers' routine for weeks. Every night, just after 2200, 7 officers left their temporary command villa to walk toward a staff car stationed at the far end of the street. They moved as if the city belonged to them. Quick strides, easy conversation, gloved hands tucked behind their belts. In their confidence lay the opening. Inside the tannery's rear workshop, the machinist positioned himself behind a broken window frame barely visible from the street. He knelt, unwrapped the crossbow, and checked each part with deliberate precision. The metal limbs creaked softly in the cold. He adjusted the tensioning springs, slid a single incendiary bolt into the groove, and secured the cloth-wrapped head with a thin wire. His breath fogged the air. His heartbeat thudded louder than the distant trucks. At 21:58, the street remained empty. At 22:01, boots appeared around the bend, first 1 pair, then 3, then all 7 officers walking in 2 staggered lines. Their uniforms caught faint reflections of the street lamps, their movements brisk, their conversation unguarded. They were close enough now that he could distinguish the clipped tones of their German phrases, even a short laugh. He raised the crossbow. The officers stepped into the narrow choke point between 2 ruined buildings. An ideal moment, the range no more than 20 meters. A pistol shot at this distance would have echoed across the district. But the crossbow released nothing but a faint mechanical snap, swallowed instantly by the cold air. The bolt streaked forward. For a split second, it was only a dark silhouette cutting through the night. Then the cloth ignited, blooming into a burst of bright flame as the incendiary mixture met oxygen. The burning shaft slammed into the lead officer's greatcoat, embedding itself in the fabric before flame surged across his chest. His scream tore through the street as fire raced upward, consuming his collar and cap in seconds. The officers froze, shocked, disoriented, unable to understand what had struck them. Then the bolt's incendiary core ruptured. Liquid fire splashed outward, spraying 2 officers beside him. Their wool coats caught instantly. Flames crawled across thick fabric, climbing toward exposed skin. Panic erupted. 1 officer stumbled backward, crashing into another as both struggled to smother the blaze with their gloved hands. Another dropped to the ground, rolling desperately across the cobblestones, only spreading the burning mixture further. The air filled with the crackling hiss of fabric igniting and the sharp chemical stench of burning gel. 2 officers managed to run several steps before collapsing. 1 fell against a wooden doorway. Within moments, the dry timber ignited, adding a dull roar to the chaos. The machinist watched only long enough to confirm the fire's spread. His training, however informal, had taught him that hesitation killed. He lowered the crossbow, slipped it back under the canvas cover, and moved through the tannery shadows toward the rear exit. Behind him, the officers' screams echoed off the stone walls, rising and falling sharply as flames overwhelmed them. A civilian window cracked open for a moment before slamming shut again. No one dared interfere. By the time German patrols reached the street minutes later, the fire had already consumed the doorway, the officers' bodies, and every trace of the weapon that had struck them. The only thing left behind was confusion. absolute, engulfing confusion. And from that confusion came consequences that shaped the resistance's next steps. The first German patrol arrived to a scene they could scarcely comprehend. The street was littered with scorched debris, fragments of wool uniforms, and the collapsed bodies of officers burned beyond recognition. Flames still clung to a section of the wooden doorway, the last remnants of the blaze flickering against the stone walls like dying embers. The patrolmen hesitated before approaching, unsure whether they were walking into an ambush or the aftermath of some catastrophic accident. Reports were rushed to the district command within minutes. By dawn, higher-ranking officers crowded the site, stepping carefully around charred remains as they debated the cause. Some insisted it had been an accident. A lantern dropped, a fuel canister ignited. Others argued for sabotage, though no explosives, shell fragments, or bullet casings could be found. The absence of conventional weapons confused them more than anything. German investigators were trained to identify gunfire wounds, grenade shrapnel, or timed charges. But here there was no blast pattern, no chemical residue typical of explosives, no projectile evidence except vague burn trajectories. Their confusion deepened when residents claimed they had heard nothing. No gunshot, no explosion, only screams and fire. In a district where every unusual sound drew attention, the silence before the blaze troubled German officers more than the fire itself. Something had struck swiftly, silently, and vanished without trace. In propaganda logs, the incident was documented as an unidentified incendiary attack, a phrase that revealed more uncertainty than control. Within the Polish resistance, the story moved quickly but quietly. Word spread through coded notes and whispered conversations the machinist's device had worked. Not partially, completely. 7 officers killed in seconds, a fortified villa disrupted, patrols mobilized in confusion. For a resistance starved of victories, the strike carried symbolic weight far beyond its tactical outcome. It proved that improvisation, not just smuggled weapons, could change the balance in small but meaningful ways. Yet celebration was muted. German reprisals were swift and ruthless. Patrol frequency increased. Search operations swept entire neighborhoods. 2 suspected safe houses were raided. Civilians were questioned, some detained, and a curfew was extended across the district. The resistance understood that any success, especially one so dramatic, came with a cost that the occupier always tried to push onto the innocent. Their responsibility was to adapt quickly, hide their tracks, and prevent the investigation from getting anywhere near the machinist. To his cell, the machinist became less an inventor and more a symbol of what desperation could produce under pressure. Commanders who once dismissed him now visited his workshop, asking if the weapon could be replicated or improved. But he refused mass production. The crossbow worked because it was used at close range under precise conditions. Replicating it widely would risk failures, and failures under occupation meant death. Instead, he refined a single principle from his creation: silence was a weapon in itself. Fire was merely the agent. The Germans eventually closed their investigation without resolution. Their final internal memo suggested an accidental ignition, an explanation they adopted not because it convinced them, but because no alternative fit their understanding of partisan capability. To accept that resistance engineers could launch a silent incendiary projectile was to admit a weakness they weren't prepared to acknowledge. In the months that followed, the memory of that night lingered in the district. Patrols walked in tighter formations. Officers avoided predictable routes, and among local civilians a quiet sense of vindication simmered. The occupier, so proud and orderly, had been struck by something they never anticipated. It was a reminder that in war, ingenuity often emerges from the margins, from those without rank or recognition, and that truth leads naturally into the larger meaning behind what happened that night. In the vast landscape of the Second World War, with its sweeping offensives, colossal armies, and industrialized destruction, stories like this often slip between the cracks. They do not appear in major battle reports. They do not shape grand strategy. They are too small, too localized, too improvised to alter the course of continents. And yet, they reveal something essential about the nature of resistance and the human spirit under occupation. The machinist's fire arrow was never meant to rival the weaponry of great powers. It was not a technological breakthrough, nor a miracle device capable of shifting entire fronts. It was a single artisan's refusal to surrender to helplessness. In a world dominated by tanks, aircraft, and mechanized divisions, he reached for what he could control: scrap metal, cloth, chemicals, and the quiet precision of his own hands. His invention did not endure. It was never replicated widely. It never appeared again in intelligence reports or battlefield dispatches. But the moment it was used carried a meaning far larger than its physical form. It represented the idea that resistance did not belong solely to soldiers, strategists, or trained operatives. It belonged to anyone who could turn fear into action and despair into creativity. In many ways, his story mirrors countless acts of defiance across occupied Europe, small, unseen, often anonymous. A sabotage that delays a train by minutes, a hidden message that prevents an arrest, a weapon fashioned from discarded scraps, each one insignificant in isolation, yet woven together into the larger fabric of resistance that challenged Nazi control not through might, but through persistence. German officers who once walked confidently down quiet streets now looked over their shoulders. Patrols varied their routes. Commanders questioned assumptions they once considered absolute, and in that subtle shift, from certainty to caution, the machinist achieved something rare. He introduced doubt into a system built on intimidation. The fire he launched that night was brief. It flared, raged, and disappeared into the cold air. But the idea behind it endured, reminding us that history is shaped not only by vast armies, but also by individuals who refuse to accept the world as it is. And when wars end and monuments rise, it is often these quieter acts of courage, improvised, underestimated, and nearly forgotten, that reveal the deepest truths about human resilience.